And with that, friends, we welcome you back to another edition of OGP, the One Giant Podcast, where I am your host, Adam Arbrecht, also covering the Brooklyn Nets on the Locked On Nets podcast, joined as always by the generational season ticket holder fan that is the healthy, wealthy, and wise Mr. Andrew Makowitz. How are we on a Monday afternoon? We held off a little bit, maybe to just digest Sunday's game that much more.
I think I'm doing good, but I think the strangest part of yesterday was the fact that it was pouring hurricane rain right by MetLife Stadium. And you saw the Giants playing at 1:00, and in Cleveland, it was like 80 degrees, and like every single player was like sun soaked. And like I saw someone on Twitter even said it. They're like, that might be the first time ever people around the New York City area like, man, I got to get to Cleveland. Look at the weather there. It's just beautiful, isn't it?
It's always sunny in Cleveland, right? The grass is always greener in Cleveland. That's true.
Yeah, that famous saying. Yeah, it's always sunnier in Cleveland, right?
As the people say. No, you're right. And like, listen, storm coming through. Obviously, hurricanes all over town here on the East Coast. So you're sitting inside on a gloomy day watching the Giants play. And obviously, we're going to get into it. We weren't sure if how many players were going to play, how many starters as we move through the week. It seemed more and more likely that less and less starters would play. That came to fruition on Sunday. So we will get to that. There's a couple of things, though, I think to cover before that. Of course, injuries coming out of that game. And then we're going to get into, we have obviously the 53. The next step is 80. That's going to come tomorrow. So a little speculative look ahead. And then you and I, when we were texting back and forth, kind of after the game, really, and it was this debate around how many roster spots are really up for grab, what guys have it locked in, and where maybe is Joe Judge when he looks out at this roster. But the big piece coming out of the game, at least, and really around the team overall, it looks like Kyle Rudolph is getting closer and closer. So while it may not have been as early on in camp as you may have liked, if he can get himself back out of the field, get some reps going, that's a good sign. It looks like Saquon Barkley is getting closer, even though it may look less and less likely that we'll see him in week one against Denver for the opener. And then specifically out of Sunday's game, we also saw a handful of injuries. Your boy Ryson John, I'm thinking it's not as serious as it may have been perceived because he makes a catch on the sideline. Then I think he hurts his ankle there. He runs back to the huddle because time's running down in the fourth quarter, and then it looks like a non-contact injury. So we'll see what comes of an ankle, Achilles, type of injury there. Madre Harper also goes out with a groin injury. He's fighting for a roster spot. And then Quincy Wilson, who, while I'll credit him with having an interception, when someone throws the ball at your chest, you better darn well catch that thing. So he makes a nice play, and then also may have hurt himself when it comes to fighting for a spot on the 53. Out of those, let's just say 3 injuries from Sunday, is Ryson John the obviously most concerning for you, Andy?
Well, he certainly was the most intriguing of them. I think Quincy Wilson actually graded out as Pro Football Focus's best defensive player for us. He did play really, really well. I think his injury might actually impact the 53 more than Ryzen John. I think knowing that Kyle Rudolph is potentially going to be back for week one, you saw some of the videos of him doing some cuts with Daniel Jones, knowing that Evan Ingram's going to be there, knowing that they love Caden Smith. There's really only one more spot, and it sounds like, Katini is going to be the one to select based on his ability to block, whereas Ryzen John is more of that athlete, get down the field, Jimmy Graham type of big-bodied receiver. Mm-hmm. So I don't know if any of the injuries were too crushing. Obviously, I want to see John out there for the finale against the Patriots in the preseason because he showed some flashes, like that 25-yard catch he had. What to me was electric. When you have all the starters sitting on the bench, at least there's someone to get excited about, some kind of raw talent that the Giants can look at.
Yeah, for sure. And it's funny. And when we were texting, this popped into my head watching him in this preseason now. Like, I almost feel like he's the type of athlete at the tight end position that you say, if we can bring this guy along over his first couple of years in the league, suddenly at the end of Evan Ingram's contract, if the question becomes, are we going to bring him back on a big deal? He's going to be 28 years old, or are we hoping just to maybe be able to move on from him? I'm not remotely saying, just put Ryson John out there. That's a like for like, but he showed he had a nice little seam up the seam catch that he had there in this game. 3 catches, 53 or 58 yards on Sunday. Like, he's showing that he can do those things. What they're asking of him now is, can you line up along the line there and still be an effective blocker. And there's even some points in this game where he was showing that, and some of the other offensive line play maybe was to his detriment in that regard. That being the case, though, takeaways from Sunday, knowing that there's no starters there, but who jumps out to you? What excited you about what you saw on Sunday? It can be also what concerned you potentially, because I think some fans were certainly reacting to the way the second unit defense looked against the Cleveland Browns. But what are either players or just maybe situational football that you liked or did not like on Sunday?
Well, I'll start with the good, and I'm pleased to say the portion is Devontae Booker. I mean, he actually looked like the guy that Dave Gettleman went out early in free agency and decided to pay them a significant guaranteed contract in case Saquon wasn't healthy. He ran hard. He looked like he was committed to his cuts. He looked like he had some power and some strength. He was really a bright spot to me, and I was not expecting it. I was expecting another game where Corey Clement would come in after the first series or so, and he'd look better, and you'd be like, why did we make this decision? So I'm pleasantly surprised about that, and that makes me happy. I'm sure you're happy to hear that I have some nice words about Booker.
Well, what I will say is, like, whatever you want to read into reports out of camp, but I think even I was like, boy, you just wonder, right? What is it going to look like here going forward for Booker? But to react off of one preseason game, essentially, you hear the rumors out of camp, but then he comes back in game 2, gets north and south in a hurry, shows a little bit of power, gets the job done. Like, I think in that regard, we all could have taken a little step back and just said, hey, friends, that's one game. Now here's game number 2. We'll get a little more taste, obviously, against the Patriots. You mentioned Clement, who got in there in the mix as well. I will say, just saying the running back group, Brightwell gets in there, gets some chances. It's far more important for Devontae Booker to be out there and to look good, right? That's far more important. So you want to have him getting the early reps. I think it's unfortunate that Brightwell gets his chance to get a handful of reps at the back end of this game, where you're just like, I don't know, man. Like, are you giving him any chance to have some level of success? A little disappointing in that regard. He looks okay, just to touch on the rookie. Like, he looked all right, but I think that he's clearly a player the Giants are thinking, let's get him to the practice squad, let's develop him. And maybe that's the perspective we should have had on him from the second that he was drafted, was the Giants want to work with and develop this player, not consider him to be any form of immediate impact.
Yeah, I think the Alfred Morris release was really telling of them saying, we asked, like, does that mean Saquon is going to be healthy? What does that mean? I think it signaled they were comfortable with the 3 guys that are going to make the roster barring an injury, and that's Clement, Booker, and Saquon. They are going to be the running backs on this roster. They're not going to carry 4 running backs. They may pull back, talk about it in a little bit. So I was very pleased to see Booker running well. I think we can all finally say it's time for Sam Beal to try his luck with a different team. Because when we talk about what didn't work, like, there was wide receivers playing cornerback in the game that looked better than Sam Beal. And that's not me even speaking hyperbole. It's actually true. Like, he was so poor in everything he was doing out there that, like, halfway through, I'm like, man, I can't believe that we thought there was promise this guy, to the point where, like, people talking, especially on social media, like, we seem to, like, gloss over that we used a high draft pick in the compensatory round to go get Sam Beal. And he has been worse than DeAndre Baker was in his first year with the Giants. Like, he didn't even play, and, like, he opts out. Talk about the draft selection of him. It feels like a huge misstep, and it's one that we just got to rip the Band-Aid off and let Sam Beal go do something somewhere else.
Well, I mean, by the way, though, compensatory 3rd-round pick versus a 1st-round pick, 2 very different sets of expectations for those cornerbacks. I think, I'll give him this. It's like, there's a lot of players on Sunday that I could look at and be like, boy, it doesn't look so sharp. It doesn't look so good. Sam Beal literally had to, we talked about this a few episodes ago, had to be perfect in his opportunities in order to maybe open some eyes. And it was such a tragic instance when a lollipop pass goes down the sideline. He's trailing. He has his head around. He's ready to make the play and just leaves his feet, elevates, and kind of floats through the air. Wide receiver comes back, makes the catch. And that felt like one of those moments of, like, maybe just it felt indicative of Sam Beal's time in the league and with the Giants so far. It's like just off the mark, right? Injury plagued rookie season, opts out in his second year. And then by the time, and they said this on the broadcast, by the time you come back around, this is not the same, secondary that you were drafted into 2 years ago, right? 3 drafts ago. This is a team that is top heavy with a guy like Bradbury and a guy like Adoree Jackson, and then Darnay Holmes, and then even an Aaron Robinson who hasn't seen the field yet, and Williams, who's another rookie. Like you're behind all these guys, so I suspect that he will be one of those players that the Giants will move on from as they make their cut to 80.
Yeah, I think it's the final goodbye to Sam Beal. But on a positive note, I gotta say we gotta be pretty happy with what your boy Carter Coughlin did yet again, Adam. Like he is really, not only is he solidifying himself as being on the roster, but I think he's proving that rotationally and situationally he can really make an impact for this team now. Like I'm not thinking about him on the bubble. I'm thinking like, how are they going to use the different pieces, knowing that he's kind of moved into the inside and things have looked really successful so far.
And you saw him on Sunday as opposed to the week prior in a lot of different positions. Saw him on the outside matching up against tight ends. Listen, he took a penalty on the one play, but everything up to the point where, as they always say, linebackers tend to get a little bit panicky when you're out in space covering a player and you reach out for them a little bit. But he did everything well. He covered a wide receiver, running back, all the way down the field into the end zone and was almost step for step. And those are kind of like the fringe plays you look at for him. Everything else, getting into the backfield, had a sack, brought a lot of pressure, got out in space, made good tackles. I think you're starting to see this level of versatility to his game that when you think about Patrick Graham and you think about that linebacking group, all of a sudden you're saying, okay, here on this particular down and distance, watch out for Carter Coughlin from here. Watch out for Lorenzo Carter. Watch out for, all these players are going to be versatile in how they get utilized. And it seems like Carter Coughlin, with his motor and energy level, is putting himself in a good spot to say, hey, Graham, you can use me in a lot of different ways, and I'm going to be able to be depended on to reach that certain threshold of, right, this is what I need to know you're capable of. He's doing that. I'll throw into the mix in that group, man. It's an important year for O'Shane Ximenez, and he looked good on Sunday. I mean, I think it's very easy to fall off of him. He gets lumped in with that Lorenzo Carter group, and I've always been a Lorenzo Carter guy. I think we've kind of said, O'Shane, okay, you do what you do, whatever. But if he can be that type of player that we saw on Sunday with a level of consistency this year, now the edge rushing group, now those guys you want to bring pressure on the quarterback, suddenly we have a couple extra players there that maybe we didn't think we were going to have.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. He definitely proved something where I was like, oh, okay. Like I know I've kind of thought it, like kind of forgotten you in the back of my mind because we've been so focused on Lorenzo Carter, but Ximenez did display the athleticism and the awareness that reminded me of why we liked him so much over the past couple of seasons. And I think he's doing himself, a really good service here in terms of getting himself involved in that mix at the edge rush outside linebacker position. As you're starting to look at all this and we see some of the starters, sit, even though a lot of Giant fans are upset that the starters aren't playing any of these meaningless games, we are getting to see like those second or third string guys. Like, are you going to make the roster? Can you contribute? How much can you contribute? A guy like Carter Coughlin getting all this playing time is huge because you could see the versatility that he is able to show out there. And so for me, I'm pretty happy with what we saw from the X-Man. The one other small note I think that Giants lose about is that Glennon looks serviceable as the backup quarterback. On the initial drive, he kind of marched the team down. He threw a couple good balls down the field. It's like, I don't need you to be a world beater. I don't need you to look like a starting quarterback in the NFL. I need to know that if you come in for half a game or we need you in one game situationally, you can at least man the ship. And that's what he looked like in his limited action out there. I was pretty pleased after a pretty terrible first preseason game.
Yes, the benchmark was set incredibly low for the backup room as far as the QB was concerned. I will say though, man, and they talked about a couple of those rollout plays for Glennon where he just needs to hit the player out there open and a little bit off the mark. And Glennon, I think I was talking with Pessimistic Mike about this, that like you have this idea in your mind. Same thing like with Colt McCoy last year, right? You think of Colt McCoy as this guy who's like 25, 26 years old. Remember, he just came into the league, but you forget about him and you think of them as they were in their mid-20s. Like Mike Glennon is in his 30s. He doesn't have quite as much spring in his legs as he used to. Like he looked a little gimpy trying to get out there in space. And to that end, I will say you made the move from Thorson. You went ahead. You decided you needed to bring in something else to the QB spot there. Lewerke, I don't know. What I would say is he seemed to have come in relatively short order, got a pretty good handle on the system, and showed this mixed bag, right? Held onto the ball a little bit long at times, but it's a hard circumstance to come into. But used his legs, moved around a little bit, showed some nice passes up the seam to a couple of players. Like, I feel, as a footnote, but I feel better about the QB room now. And there's a world where you could be talking about, I don't know, would you be shocked if Lewerke ended up being kind of the backup guy that you would go to because of the versatility he has out of that spot if you needed to go to him in a pinch? I mean, let's not belabor it. It's inconsequential if Daniel Jones goes down, but I at least like the spark that he shows. Certainly an upgrade instantaneously over what was Thorson.
Yeah, I mean, look, Thorson was always going to be on the practice squad. He was never going to make the active that traditionally only like having two quarterbacks on the roster because Eli Manning was so durable. Maybe we need to change that perception now, given that Daniel Jones has had a couple of different knocks. Listen, there's going to be plenty of quarterbacks that are released over the next 2 weeks as we talk about trimming down some of these roster spots. There's going to be, backup potential guys that we may be able to bring in and give a look. Secretly, we're probably saying Lewerke is going to be on the practice squad. If we have another guy battling it out for Mike Glennon for the backup role, then that's fine as well.
Quick footnote here, because the next thing I want to get into is just for sake of argument, Matt Lombardo put out his new 53-man roster projection. Just, we bounce around some of these ideas. I want to get to this sense of how many spots we actually think are up for grabs, but it is worth mentioning, just as a passing statement, that Ryan Santoso is getting mentioned now in trade rumors, that teams out there in the league that are looking for a quality kicker, he's showing everything you want in training camp, in these preseason games, showing a powerful leg. The Giants, you say, why'd you bring him in when you got Gano? We all know what's going to look like. The Giants may have just turned him into an asset. Like, they may have turned him into a 6th-round pick from another team, maybe, I don't know, maybe a 5, maybe a positional body backup somewhere down on the depth chart, a 3rd string, borderline 2nd string guy potentially. Like, when a team looks desperate and they want to come get this kicker, this is just an organizational note. I love the fact that the Giants have this kid to be able to say, looking pretty good. What are you willing to give up for him?
Yeah, well, I mean, Adam, let's be honest. Let's give credit to where credit is due. It's all about the special teams coach. I don't know if you have thought about all the different success that the Giants have had, but Thomas McGahee is this. Yeah. He's like the kicking whisperer, right? Like, you look at Aldrick Rosas comes out of nowhere, has like a Pro Bowl type season. Then you revitalize Graham Gano's career after he was sitting out without a job for a little while. And now you look at a guy that has not even kicked in a regular season game, didn't even kick it in a preseason game so far, and is drawing trade interest. You're like, what is going on here? And it makes me think, is it more the guy that's pulling the strings who knows how to give these guys confidence that kicking is more mental than it is physical? Or is it that they just keep finding diamonds in the rough that continue to do this?
Yeah, it's interesting. And like you said, it's a carryover from the previous regime. So it always speaks highly when you can survive a changeover at the head coaching position, and as things happen on the staff, you stay there because you're good at your job. And at the very least, the Giants know they have that in special teams. And that's going to go into the conversation we're going to have here around Lombardo's breakdown here as far as the 53-man roster is concerned. We talked about, as I said at the top, how many roster spots are really up for grabs here. When you asked me the question, I think you said percentage, and I had to think about what numbers equal what percentages before I threw something out there. But I was like, maybe 4 to 6 spots would be something. And you kind of said, maybe 2 or 3 would be that, it's all pretty locked up. But I mean, we can talk about Lombardo's breakdown. It's just speculative. We can have our own opinion about where they should go. But when I start to run through the list, I do have there's a handful of positions that I think very much are debatable about what handful of players are going to make it through or not. And injuries are a factor here. We gloss over the idea of who's going to get cut tomorrow because even a couple of injuries yesterday kind of say, well, you can earmark I got a couple of guys here that might not make it. Maybe some guys go to the PUP list certainly as well. But is 2 to 3? I mean, is that, you really think there's that? And this is about Joe Judge. You think that Joe Judge right now only sees 2 or 3 spots on his roster where he thinks it's debatable about who's the starter or who's the backup or who's the third string versus who's getting cut or going to the practice squad.
Yeah, I admittedly think that it's less. I think this is the thing that we like to do to make preseason seem very meaningful is we like to see like there's all like if this guy plays really hard, he'll make the roster because he just shows up. And it's like it's not that simple because there just aren't that many roster spots. Like when you start actually calculating, and we can go through this depending on how you want to do it, but like we know the Giants are going to keep two quarterbacks. It is going to be Mike Glennon as the backup and Daniel Jones as the starter. Like that's two roster spots that no matter what you say or do, those are going to be set in stone. We know the punter, the kicker, and the long snapper. Those are three spots that every team has. That's five roster spots that without even thinking about players' names, you know that they're going to be on the roster. And as you start going down the list, we know that the Giants have traditionally had three running backs. They're likely going to keep three running backs. Corey Clement, Devontae Booker, and Saquon Barkley. We're already up to 8 spots that without having to go into anything are already locked in and set in stone that I would put large amounts of money that those people will be on the roster. And so as you start going down, Adam, really the question is more like, are we keeping an extra player at X position or are we keeping an extra player at this position because they provide other value like in special teams and things like that. So that one roster spot is actually just shifted between two different players. So in your mind, you're like, oh, this guy might make the roster or this guy might make the roster. That seems like two transactions. It's actually a one roster spot that they're fighting for.
Well, and I'll quickly, so a footnote that I think, and you could be right, and I'll be curious. It's almost an exercise, actively in the moment of how many names do I come across here where I say could or could not make the 53, and think about the fact that the practice squad's a little bit expanded now too. So you're thinking about who could make it through to that, and I think we've talked about it before. There's this combination of a guy that's going to make the 53 might be more likely to do so if it's less likely that he makes it through the waiver wire to get to the practice squad, right? So you're also playing a little bit of this game around, well, if we cut, we're going to get to the wide receivers here. If we cut John Ross because he hasn't been on the field that much this preseason, okay, but he's a name. He's got some cachet. He's got speed. Is it more likely that he would get picked up by another team, or is it more likely that a CJ Board would get picked up? Well, that's the debate, right? Maybe it's more likely that Board can make it through. Before I want to get to the wide receiver room, the quick footnote on the running backs is you saw on Sunday, something we didn't talk about, and that's Eli Penny. He was getting reps as the running back, and he played that in high school. I don't know if he played it all at college, but they basically said, like, this is about in a league that's getting away from the traditional fullback, Eli Penny needs to showcase that he can do some of these things. And I actually found it very encouraging the way he looked, because to me, what I saw was, oh, okay, you can carry a fullback or fourth running back. And this guy looks like a very nice compliment to have just in case what could happen with Saquon Barkley. You give your feedback on that inside of this wide receiver group as we talk about it, because when you look at Lombardo, he said Golladay, Shepard, Slayton, Tony, obviously, the obvious top ones. Then John Ross, CJ Board, and David Sills. That's the way he lanes it. Now, here's where I'll say I think it's a little bit up for debate here. And I'll be very curious to see what goes on in the final preseason game against the New England Patriots, because you may think this is crazy. There's a couple of pieces here. You mentioned the guy that's playing defense too, with special teams upside. So where suddenly kind of out of nowhere, seemingly, he may have some type of opportunity, maybe through the practice squad, to be around on this roster. But I'll even go higher profile here. I think that Dante Pettis, I'll be very curious to see if he gets an opportunity against the Patriots, maybe with some of the number ones mixed in with Daniel Jones, to try to showcase what he can do in a somewhat prominent receiver role. That's what they wanted to see on Sunday. CJ Board, can you catch it? He showed he can be used on offense as well. Sills, again, showed more positivity around his game, contested catches. Right now, if I'm talking about John Ross, who has the injury history and is showing more of the injury history in preseason, I'm not going to shy away from keeping Dante Pettis on this roster and saying, John Ross, it was nice to bring you in, but if I'm going to go into this season and keep you occupied on a roster spot, I have to have some assurance. Like, you need to be out there on Sunday, dress rehearsal, showing me that you're healthy and ready to go, because otherwise you've basically been up and down the entire training camp.
You know, it is interesting. Julian Love had this statement about Matt Cole playing all over the place, and they said they call him Windex as his nickname because you pretty much put him on anything and it cleans it, or like it helps fix it, which I thought was interesting. So now you'll know if Matt Cole shows up again, they may be calling him Windex. Listen, I don't think that there's any opportunity for Dante Pettis to be able to make this roster. I don't think there's anything that he can do in the last preseason game because we know Joe Judge wants to play the starters at least at least the first quarter, if not into the second quarter, sometime before halftime, get them out of there, make sure they're ready for the regular season. There are so many people ahead of Dante Pettis that can do so many other things. You talked about Matt Cole. The fact that he could play, he plays corner on special teams. He plays wide receiver. He played cornerback during the game. Like, he brings way more versatility than Dante Pettis does. And like, when you think about who's already going to be making the roster, we know that Kadarius Toney, Sterling Shepard, Kenny Galladay are absolute locks. Darius Slayton is an absolute lock. So you've got 4 guys that are going to be there. And then there's the mix of the David Sills, John Ross, CJ Board. All of them provide way more upside and flexibility over someone like Dante Pettis, who's a very one-dimensional type of player.
No, and that's true. I think the difference for me would be like with, again, John Ross, you'd say, well, you have value in the return game or in special teams, but they're also kind of earmarking these other players to take on those roles. So it's a very curious thing. In a very practice squad related note around the wide receivers, I will say I'm pretty much out on Bachman. I quoted it over on Twitter. I said you can turn in your playbook whenever you're ready. Damian Willis has shown he deserves a practice squad spot over Bachman at this point. Bachman had a number of opportunities, came up short in that regard. Beyond that, though, I mean, Austin Mack, we haven't seen him at all dealing with his injury. And I guess, listen, I guess Matt Cole, it almost feels more likely that he'll make the team in the secondary than he will at wide receiver, but it'll be interesting to see. I don't read too much into the offensive line beyond the starters because, again, you're going to carry 9 at least, you figure 5 with another 4 backing them up. I liked what Hedgie showed a little bit of. Harrison finally got back out there, so you saw some healthy things. I wonder, you assume Hedgie goes through the practice squad, but there is some speculation. Again, this is that who could get picked up versus who we know we can make it through to our practice squad. So things to keep an eye on there. Offensively, otherwise than that, I think Bryson John could have been making some case for himself, but now when you hear that Kyle Rudolph is on his way back, and you also hear by all accounts that this is low level. Nobody seemed to be talking about him, but Caden Smith is being very well regarded in camp. Like, he's doing what you want him to do. He's being seen, not heard, right? They're not calling his number out. So I wondered if the Giants were looking at the tight end group and saying, how do we have versatility? How do we create these packages? But now all indications are we're going to carry at least, 3, maybe 4, depending on if Rudolph, where's he going to start? Maybe on the PUP list, maybe on that IR list that only tells you 3 games. So maybe there's not as much going on there on the offensive side. Defensively is where I think I find it interesting. Like, where would you say is the biggest question mark as far as handful of players that are or are not making this roster positionally?
That's the tough part, is that I think there's going to be a cornerback or someone in the secondary that has the versatility to be able to play special teams the way that Joe Judge wants them to, that may be able to have that type of Julian Love, Logan Ryan can play multiple positions. I got to think that it's kind of around there, because when you talk about kind of the edge rushing outside linebacking room, it feels like there's kind of 6 guys that are pretty much locked into it, especially given Cam Brown's versatility on special teams that he showed in the last preseason game. You got to love that. Like, he can play, edge rusher outside. He was awesome on special teams, and that really is carving himself out a niche. You had said Anderson isn't going to make the roster. I think you're right on that one. I don't think there's really that many decisions to be made other than, we got Josh Jackson. Is Sam Beal going to be around? Aaron Robinson's probably going to go to the PUP list because he hasn't been able to play at all. And you look at Madre Harper, who people said he was playing great coverage. I thought that he looked a little bit out of his depths, even against second string. So I could only imagine what the first string would look like. So that's why I kind of go back to it, Adam, and I keep saying maybe we one extra wide receiver, which lessens the amount of cornerbacks that we can have, or maybe we take one more edge rusher, linebacker, and one less wide receiver. But really, we're just talking about one roster spot or 2 roster spots that's being moved around depending on positional need.
Yeah, and I mean, you talk about the defensive line. We know Leonard Williams, Dexter Lawrence. You want to throw Austin Johnson. Seems like he's doing a nice job in the middle there. You've also got B.J. Hill, Danny Shelton, and then Raymond Johnson has looked pretty strong. Now that is 6, so I think you start to say that's a solid number, and that's by Lombardo standards. I look at a David Moa and I just wonder if he has any. He's shown nice little flashes. Again, he's a young player, and that's I think a difference too about the risk reward. You know what it does? It reminds me of, as always, right? Ryan Connolly, right? This piece of things that everyone seems that they like and they think that this guy is flashed. And what is he worth? I wonder about a Trent Harris. Right now, Lombardo would have him not making the cut. It's been small sample size. It's been against backups, but he's looked fairly sound in those opportunities. Reggie Ragland, guaranteed spot there. Did Devontae Downs damage himself so much on Sunday that all of a sudden he's on the outside looking in for a roster spot? Because we kind of thought of him as being, here's a guy that started for us last year, but he can be a solid backup. Now I'm thinking, maybe I'd just rather have one of these young players. Ryan Anderson, by the way, the reason why it was an immediate for me was as a veteran linebacker, the very first play that I saw from him was a run to the outside where he was like, sweet baby Jane, I'm going to come in and seal this edge deep and tight in towards the quarterback. And I mean, he just left 15 yards of wide open space. It was one of the more egregious mistakes that you can make as far as a linebacker is concerned. So I just thought, too late for you to kind of make a flash here as far as it goes. I mean, you say the linebacker group, I think that's fairly set in stone, so I can appreciate that. Inside of the cornerback room, Keon Crossan is probably the interesting one. That's the special teams addition when you look at him in that regard. Everybody else you feel pretty good about. I'm surprised that you haven't heard or seen a lot of Josh Jackson per se, and yet we think that he's going to make it through in that group. Like, it's an interesting, and that's where this Matt Cole piece comes in, right? Like, well, you assume you got Josh Jackson over here instead of Yadam because of special teams value, but then where are you going to stash Matt Cole? And that to maybe rewind it's to say Matt Cole's not going to make the 53. If he's going to be on the practice squad with a chance to develop. And I think that he showed enough on Sunday to warrant saying we want to get a longer look at this kid and see what he's capable of. Listen, maybe you're right. I mean, maybe there really is only these handful of players. I think the interesting thing is that from week 1 to week 2 and now going to week 3, what we really find is that the injuries make a lot of these decisions for the coaching staff, I think, right? Every single week, a couple of guys get hurt. Chris Johnson got hurt. So then you say, okay, he's not going to be here anymore. Whatever his spot was, let's take that one away. And then when you start to bump people up the pecking order, I think that's where you start to see this clear drop off of what's the 53 versus what's a practice squad guy. Well, we were talking about having 2 guys that were 53 worthy. Now I've only got 1. We thought we had 4 guys. Now I only have 2. And maybe that thins it out in a way that I wasn't thinking about it necessarily, in the same context as, say, preseason week 1, right? Or just before the preseason game started, when you see all of this talent and you wonder how all these pieces fit into place.
Yeah, I mean, I'll give a prime example of where my head is at. You have a guy like Devontae Downs, and you have a guy like CJ Board, and you have a guy like Josh Jackson, right? Mm-hmm. 3 guys. If we said that there's only 2 roster spots, one of them is going to miss out. It's all about what other pieces we're going to be keeping, because we know that there's going to be at least 5 wide receivers. We know that there's a certain amount where they're going to have at least 5 cornerbacks. So like when you think about it, there's a couple of these guys where you and I could say, well, maybe they'll make the roster, but that's because there's 4 guys fighting for 2 roster spots or 5 guys fighting for 3 roster spots. That's about it, because all these other players are pretty much locked and loaded. It's just a matter of whether Joe Judge needs another defensive back, whether the offensive line is still coming back from injury, or, at this point, who gets released during some of these cuts that isn't even on our radar that'll end up making the 53 because they're better than some of our backups.
Let's very quickly, as we like to say, at the end of the day, give me 1 or 2 players that you have on the 53 that are the first ones out the door if player X becomes available on the market, right? If you see a cut that comes here, who are the 1 or 2 players that you automatically say, see you later? And maybe let's look beyond the backup offensive line, just because I feel like that would be maybe too easy to say.
I'm like, did you mean Kenny Wiggins? Were you specifically like, what were you trying to say there? Because
what
Kenny Wiggins felt
with the initials KW would you cut if you needed a roster spot?
Yeah, I mean that's tough, because I think that the backup offensive line is clearly the first place that we go because we don't really need that much else in other places. Like, okay, if a tight end becomes available, if Rudolph isn't going to play, maybe Hikatini. If there's a guy that's a little bit more dynamic and could come in for the first 4 to 6 weeks and help us out, especially if Ryzen John's injury is not going to allow him to play in the final preseason game. So maybe tight end. I don't see us bringing in another wide receiver because that would just like wildly confuse a room that we're trying to condense into what we want, not like add another random lottery ticket into the mix. Other than that, I feel pretty good. Like maybe the third string quarterback, as we just mentioned, we just picked up Lurkey. He looked fine. If someone else becomes available, maybe he comes in and competes a little bit for practice squad spot. But yeah, there is too much outside the offline that I think we desperately need to take a look at.
We will take a look at what happens tomorrow as the cuts come through, maybe some player pickups. I think we'll probably end up coming back in on Thursday and setting the table for the final preseason game and then some takeaways that we get because you want to give a couple of days here for some moves to happen. It is going to be interesting to see who comes out on the waiver wire and how some of these players end up really looking. You know, we have all the things we're excited about versus what the reality is. Last footnote I'll say, man, about Sunday's game, the offensive line, the backups, played pretty well. Backups against backups, they looked pretty good. And I'm going to put it out there again. I feel like everyone is ready to say the sky is falling, say that it's all on the edge here. Art Stapleton says we should be trading Darius Slayton or Darnay Holmes to get an offensive lineman. Like, it's all right to take the deep breath and allow the preseason to play itself out and assess where you are. Like, if it turns out that you're missing something, it's going to be brutal. But I don't think that you automatically jump to that conclusion as a lot of people were after week 1 of the preseason. Let's see what happens against the Patriots. And by the way, 2 practice sessions before that one, we're going to understand what's going on there and what some of the needs may be for Big Blue.
Giant, Adam, quick side note. Giants covered the spread in the game. In case you're wondering, the spread opened at 4.5. Giants lost by 4. We'll take the points when we can get them.
You better believe it. Already on to victory as we set the template for the season ahead. We'll be back in later in the week covering the cuts and the pickups that the Giants make as they head for their final preseason matchup, what is becoming now a tradition against the New England Patriots. Until then, follow us on social media at One Giant Podcast. Subscribe, rate, review the podcast wherever you get those needs fulfilled, and check us out on YouTube as we stream live and answer all those little tidbits and quandaries and questions you may have over in the chat box. Until next time, as Andy Makowitz would want, need, and demand that you, the people, know.
As always, let's go Big Blue.